Hello. This video is going to be a response to a comment that was left by one of my subscribers on my previous video. The subscriber who left the comment, the user who left the comment, is someone named Luka, and if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, I'm sorry. But anyway, Lukasz left a comment on my previous video, and he asked two questions to me. Now, I had started to reply to his comment, to write back an answer, and somewhere at some point in the midst of composing my reply, I had just lost the will to continue writing for one reason or another. But despite this, there is an answer, or there are answers to both of his questions in my head, and it just seemed easier to me to simply sit down and make a video in which I respond to his questions. Just because I, for whatever reason, don't at the moment have the will to write the answer down, and also because if I were to simply reply to his comment in a comment of my own, it would be banished to the comments section of an obscure video, whereas if I were to put my answer into a video, it may be the case that it may prove useful or interesting to someone else. Because there might be a few things in what I say in my reply that might prove of interest to at least somebody. So here goes. I'm going to read Lukasz's comment, and then I'm going to reply to it. So here's how it goes. He says, first, thank you, Ivan. I have two questions. One, why is Western university discourse in such a mess? If truth and reason is on our side, why do conservative authors, some of whom you mention, and professors not fight back? Are they lacking in the virtue of courage or something? And number two, should we continue to argue with liberals in real life and on Facebook, or just save energy and direct it to some online forums and communities? Okay. I suppose in some ways the answers to both of these questions are related to one another, but I'll tackle them one by one. So, starting with the first question, why is Western university discourse such a mess today? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. There are a lot of reasons for why public discourse in general in the West is a mess, and not just university discourse. And by public discourse, I mean discussions about certain important political issues, things of public concern. And these could be anything from war to euthanasia to immigration policy, uh, gay marriage, you name it. Anything contentious and important, politically speaking, that affects some given political community. Essentially, public debate. By public debate, I mean debate about what it is right for some community to do as a community, what policies the state should enact, that sort of thing. The reason that public debate in general is so bad these days in the West, there are a lot of reasons. One of them was one that I actually went over in my previous video. Now, I have an unfortunate tendency, and I realize this, to really go on and ramble for an extremely long amount of time. And it may be that in my previous video, because it was so long, the real meaning of the argument I tried to present had gotten lost in a sea of verbiage. So I'm going to try and restate the argument that I gave in that previous video in a more condensed form. And this is really going to be the first major reason for why I think public discourse in general, not just in universities in the West, but among politicians, political pundits, judges, and so forth, anyone concerned with public issues who wants to debate them, is so bad. And the argument goes like this. First, let me define a term before I go into it. The term is comprehensive doctrines. This is a term that John Rawls uses when he speaks of what he calls public reason, and I'll describe what that is in a minute. Now, by a comprehensive doctrine, Rawls and the other contemporary liberal thinkers who follow him means something like anything which influences or helps one to form a total view of the world, a Weltanschauung, a worldview, anything fundamental which underlies a person's worldview. So they're things from which certain basic premises come. They're doctrines or things that provide one with a comprehensive set of answers for how to look at life as a whole. And these can be things like religions. They're usually religions, but they're not always exclusively religions. A comprehensive doctrine could also be something like some kind of theory in fundamental metaphysics. And the answer that I went back to again and again in the previous video was Aristotelian teleology. So it could be a religion or some kind of basic fundamental view of metaphysics, that sort of thing. That's what Rawls and other liberals have in mind when they speak of comprehensive doctrines. So the argument that Rawls and those following him give goes like this. He says, in a pluralistic society, which is diverse and in which there are many people, all of whom have all sorts of differing comprehensive doctrines, if we want to establish peace in this society and make sure that people get along, we cannot allow them to bring their comprehensive doctrines to bear when they engage in public debate. So when people engage in public discourse, they cannot refer to their comprehensive doctrines. If you are a Catholic, for example, you can be a Catholic, but if you were to make arguments for why abortion was wrong, for example, it's inadmissible, according to this kind of Rawlsian liberal restriction, to say that abortion should not be allowed and the state should not tolerate it, it should be made illegal because the Catholic Church prohibits it. That's considered inadmissible because it specifically refers to a comprehensive doctrine, in this case Catholicism. But you could extend that type of reasoning to anything. So now, the reason why it is not admissible for people living in a pluralistic society to make reference to their comprehensive doctrines when they're engaged in public discourse is that different comprehensive doctrines obviously disagree on their fundamental beliefs about the world. They disagree fundamentally in their worldviews. And this is a crucial assumption of contemporary liberalism, reason does not have the power to resolve these conflicts between comprehensive doctrines. And so when two comprehensive doctrines clash with one another, there is no way, it is believed, to sit down and reason out the differences between them and decide which of them is right and which is wrong, and come to an agreement that way. There's no recourse to argument here that can be had because reason can't resolve these problems. Therefore, if two comprehensive doctrines differ about something, the only way to resolve the problem is to fight it out. But the contemporary liberal wants to maintain peace at all costs. So he wants to prevent this sort of thing from happening. Therefore, he has to say that you can't make reference to comprehensive doctrines when you engage in public debate. You can't get everyone in your pluralistic society here to agree on these comprehensive doctrines. You can't get everyone to agree on your premises, and so you just can't make use of them. Now, and from that, Rawls and others go on to form a conception of what he calls public reason, and that he thinks will provide a basis for what we're allowed to make reference to when we engage in public debate. That's not what I want to go into. The point is just this restriction on bringing comprehensive doctrines into public debate itself is interesting. The reason it's interesting is that if you take this view seriously, an enormous problem arises from it. The problem is this. Whenever we wish to defend or form fundamental philosophical justifications for some view that we have, some view in ethics or meta-ethics, or a position on some political issue like abortion or euthanasia, if we want to go all the way back to first principles and form final, ultimate philosophical justifications for whatever it is that we're arguing for, we actually have to make reference to our comprehensive doctrines. We have to eventually get into discussions about religion or theology or metaphysics or something like that. Eventually, at some point, if we want to go all the way to the most basic sort of principles and offer up the full justification, we have to do that. The problem is, as already described, contemporary liberalism doesn't allow you to do that. And because contemporary liberalism doesn't allow you to create these ultimate justifications, liberalism itself becomes a kind of foundationless doctrine. Okay? So liberalism's own fundamental assumptions make it impossible to justify any ethical views at all, including liberal ethical views. So liberalism's fundamental presuppositions make it impossible to create a foundation for liberalism itself. Liberalism kind of undercuts itself in this really weird way. So it's a doctrine that is by design foundationless. And if you take it seriously, if you truly take these liberal restrictions on public debate seriously, you ultimately cannot come up with ultimate rationales for any sort of ethical position on any subject at all. You have to be an ethical nihilist. The problem is that a lot of liberal philosophers today emotionally reject that conclusion. They don't want to be nihilists, just like any sane person wouldn't want to be that. And so they have to make up arguments for their liberal commitments anyway. Because they can't make reference to religion or metaphysics or anything like that within the rules of liberalism, they have to sneak in different terms and do what the author of the book that I was talking about in my last video, Stephen Smith, calls smuggling. And what this means is they have to bring in certain liberal buzzwords, things like freedom or equality or reciprocity or human rights or human dignity, these other terms, these buzzwords that you see floating around in liberal discourse all the time. They have to bring in these words and they have to sneak them into their argument. But of course, those terms only make sense within the context of certain metaphysical assumptions. But you can't explicitly bring out those metaphysical assumptions because of the restrictions that liberalism places on public debate. And so that means that all public discourse which operates within the rules set down by liberalism necessarily has to be vapid, uninspired, uninteresting, and just really bad. No one really seems to be allowed to make fundamental, basic philosophical arguments anymore in justification of their positions. And so discourse necessarily becomes very bad, of very poor quality. That's the argument that I tried to give in my previous video, and I flesh the argument out more in that video, and I give specific examples for how that sort of thing works. But the basic point is, one reason why contemporary public discourse in Western liberal societies is so bad is that liberalism's own rules for what is admissible in public discourse necessarily make it so that the discourse has to be bad because you can't provide ultimate justifications for your beliefs. So that's one reason. There are other reasons for why public discourse is such a mess. Another reason is just that liberals dominate the universities. In Western universities, American universities, and Western European universities as well, the majority of all of the faculties in the humanities and the social sciences and all of these sorts of areas, in the hard sciences it may be a bit different, but for any of the subjects that are more concerned with politics and with public debate and all that sort of thing, the things that are more germane to this, they are overwhelmingly dominated by liberals. And it's not uncommon to see a university faculty that's composed of 70 or 80% liberals or something like that. There are very few actual conservative professors in Western universities today, and there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that the conservative professors that are there, the right-leaning professors that are there, tend to be rather quiet about their views. They don't express them. They're not outspoken. And one reason for that is that they just don't want to make a lot of noise. They don't want people to notice them because they know that in the universities, liberalism has this hegemonic power. It's completely dominant. And so if word gets out that someone is a conservative, this person will be subject to harassment. He may be denied tenure. If you're a young scholar looking to become a professor at the university level, you may not even get hired if it becomes widely known that you have right-wing political views. So a lot of conservative intellectuals tend to hide their views. They keep them secret. And so the ones that are outspoken are very few in number. So a minority of professors is even conservative to begin with, but only a small minority of those are outspoken. And so you actually have very few conservative intellectuals who are even bothering to debate with liberals in universities. So So part of the problem that right-leaning professors face is, yes, as you suggested, that some of them might just not be fighting back because they're lacking courage, because they're afraid of being fired, they're afraid of being denied tenure, they don't want to destroy their own careers. But another reason is that there just aren't that many of them. There are very few of them. Another reason for why, like, okay, let's get into the question of why there are so few conservative or right-leaning intellectuals. One big reason I think is that it has to do with self-selection. So there are a lot of bright people who lean to the right politically, who don't bother to go through what you have to go through to get advanced degrees. I know people like this myself. I know quite a few smart people who lean to the right, but who went to college, who got their bachelor's degree, and who left and said that's it. They don't want anything else to do with it because they don't want to be surrounded by liberals all the time. And they're not attracted to the idea of being a professor at a university because they know that all their colleagues are going to be liberals. They're going to be surrounded by these people all the time, and it's going to get terribly lonely. So part of the problem, part of the reason for why there's so few conservative intellectuals is that the whole thing tends to be a kind of self-reinforcing feedback loop where intelligent conservatives realize that liberals dominate the universities. And so, because they don't want to deal with the problems that would be associated with being a professor, the professional problems they would encounter, they just choose not to go into that line of work at all to begin with, and they do something else. And those conservatives that do become professors are ultimately very few in number. So this kind of reinforces liberal dominance of the universities. There's a book about this by Neil Gross. It's called Why Professors Are Liberal and Why Conservatives Should Care. And he talks about a lot of this, especially this self-selection thing that I described, where a lot of bright conservatives just don't decide to go into academia at all in the first place. They don't bother to get advanced academic degrees because they just don't want to go there. They just don't want to be involved in that. Partly also probably because they see how dominated universities are by liberals, and they see that the universities are producing so much poison now, and they just don't want to be involved in that. They just don't want to dirty their hands with it, so they never go into the field in the first place. So that's one reason why conservatives aren't fighting back. Conservative intellectuals aren't fighting back against liberals because there aren't that many conservative intellectuals. Man, there are a few, Alasdair MacIntyre. I don't know if I'd call Alasdair MacIntyre a conservative. This argument, by the way, that I gave earlier in this video and in the previous one about liberalism's restrictions on what's admissible in public debate, undercutting liberalism itself, I think MacIntyre has made this kind of argument himself, or at least a similar argument. I haven't read any of MacIntyre's work. I sort of know this secondhand, but MacIntyre's very old. He'll be 90 soon. I wouldn't be surprised if he were just no longer with us after a few years. So yes, there are very few conservative intellectuals. Now, as for the second question, should we continue to argue with liberals or just save our energy on community building among those of us on the right? I don't know. There really is no definite answer to that question as far as I can see it. You sort of have to make a judgment call. It depends on the liberal that you're contemplating interacting with. If you get the sense that this particular liberal is honest, that he's open to intellectual discussion, that his opinion might be changed, that he might be converted, that you could plant some seeds that will later develop and grow and germinate into something, then yeah, by all means, debate with him and talk to him. Also, if the liberal happens to be someone prominent, someone that could get you attention if you engage with them, it may also be wise to do it. On the other hand, it's probably not a good idea to spend all your time arguing with people on the internet. We have lives to live, we have communities to build. For example, there are people on the right complaining about the demographic decline of European populations. So rather than sitting on the internet all day and babbling with inconsequential people and getting nowhere, start a family, have some kids, build a community, network with like-minded people. That sort of thing should definitely be done. On the other hand, you also don't want to become insular. So you have to strike some kind of balance between community building on the right, between like-minded people, and then engaging with and debating liberals. And I frankly don't know where the line is, but you do have to strike some kind of balance. Don't stop arguing with people completely, don't stop interacting completely, but be strategic about who you engage. Don't just randomly debate everyone, because you're not going to be able to convince most people. Um, that's it. That's really all I can say on that. Um, as I sort of said uh, in one of my previous videos a while back, I think this was the Stop White People video. The university system as it exists now is just, it's loaded with liberals who have total power over the university system, and they've created a kind of bubble for themselves. There are so few conservatives around that most of the professors there don't actually have to engage with serious right-wing arguments anymore, and so they sort of rest on their laurels and become lazy, and you get this sort of navel-gazing outlook where everyone agrees with everyone, and the whole thing becomes a massive circle jerk, and that of course leads to declining intellectual standards. So rather than trying to take back the universities, it may just be better for conservatives to break off from them entirely and form their own intellectual institutions. Um, the internet will enable us to do that. The internet's been a huge help in that regard. I mean, the alt-right, for example, I cannot imagine a group like that existing without the internet. Libertarians have been able to grow enormously as a movement because of the internet and so on. So the internet in particular has allowed things that the ordinary liberal establishment would not have allowed to grow. Now, yesterday, I should probably mention this, control over the assigning of internet domain names was handed over to ICANN, which is an international body, and the worry now is that ICANN may be influenced by foreign governments like Russia, China, Iran, and so forth to remove websites from the internet, to censor certain speech on the internet, and that sort of thing. Whereas previously, that service, the assigning of domain names to IP addresses, that was controlled by the United States, and it was kept largely free of any kind of meddling. So the worry now about the internet, now that this has happened, is that significant parts of it may be shut down, that this kind of dissident discussion that people on right-wing internet communities are having may not be allowed anymore, and that's obviously a problem. What I would say in response to that is if things were to get that bad that they would actually begin shutting down various places, it's very important for people within the right, broadly thought of, to have computer skills. You know, understand how computers work, learn how computer networks work, or at least become friends with people who do, so that if it should happen that you should get shut down, or God forbid the internet as a whole becomes unusable anymore, you can secede from the internet and create your own sort of large-scale computer networks, your own sort of internet apart from the internet. I mean, that I suppose would be a last resort. That's something that we should be able to take advantage of if the situation becomes bad enough. And because we would have that ability, I don't think that the genie will ever fully be put back in the bottle. The internet has allowed for an enormous proliferation of information and discussion and free exchange of ideas, and I don't think that's going to stop. Even if the internet in its current form were to somehow be destroyed, it can always be remade, provided there are enough people with the technical skills to do that. So yeah, that's that. Public discussion in the West, especially universities, is bad because liberalism doesn't allow for interesting discussions. Its own fundamental assumptions don't allow for that. Also, liberals control the universities, and they've insulated themselves from discussion. Conservatives are very few in number. There are very few conservative intellectuals to fight this, very few right-wing intellectuals that can fight this. And a lot of bright people who lean to the right politically are just not interested in having academic careers. And that creates a very bad situation. So if we are to have the kind of intellectual discussion that any healthy movement should have, we have to largely move the base of discussion away from the formal university system into the internet. If the internet gets shut down, we rebuild it. That's it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Um, I hope that answers your question, Lucas. If anything isn't clear, just ask me something again. And that's it. Thank you for listening.